Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends. I'm very sorry that I can't be with you today, but an unfortunate scheduling clash with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change means that I have to be in Mexico right now. I did want to send you this recorded presentation though in hope that it adds to the constructive discussions during the day. In my presentation today, I would like to provide some perspective on the relevance of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions for global climate change. In particular, I'd like to focus on three separate things. The first one is, how much do direct livestock emissions contribute to actual warming now and in future? It's surprising how hard it is to actually find a simple answer to that question. However, I'll try to give you an answer in my presentation today, and from there move on to discussing an aspirational global goal for emissions reductions from agriculture to support the Paris Agreement, building on the work by a large international author team. And to finish off with a positive note, I'd like to then survey some of the growing international science-based activities designed to support agricultural mitigation around the world. On the first point, how much does livestock contribute to actual warming? We have reasonable global estimates of current direct emissions of methane and nitrous oxide from livestock, but that doesn't mean we actually know how much they contribute to actual warming. The main reason for that problem is that typically relies on translating emissions of non-CO2 gases into what's commonly called carbon dioxide or CO2 equivalents. But doing that is actually contentious, and it's fair to say in New Zealand, highly contentious. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if there aren't several people in the audience with whom I might have had endless discussions on that point. The reason why it's contentious is that methane in particular has a fairly short lifetime of only about 12 years in the atmosphere. By contrast, carbon dioxide has a lifetime of hundreds and some parts of it thousands of years in the atmosphere. As a result, carbon dioxide accumulates over time, whereas methane does not. So the notion of treating those two gases as completely interchangeable via CO2 equivalents is rather problematic. So even though we know that the global emissions from livestock today are about 9% of total global greenhouse gas emissions, that doesn't actually tell us whether livestock are causing 9% of the observed warming and whether they will cause 9% of the observed warming in future. And I just want to illustrate to you how problematic a comparison of different sectors based on their emissions is. You see three pie charts in front of you. They all purport to show the contribution of different sectors to global current greenhouse gas emissions. The pie chart on the left uses a metric called the global warming potential with a time horizon of 100 years, which is the metric that's used in current climate change reporting under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Paris Agreement, and gets used and updated regularly by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Based on that metric, agriculture would seem to be responsible for about 14% of total global greenhouse gas emissions at present. However, there are other metrics that one can use to compare different greenhouse gases. So the pie chart on the right uses a metric called global temperature change potential, also with a time horizon of 100 years. Now, if one were to use that metric, then agriculture would seem to contribute only just over 7% to total global greenhouse gas emissions. However, if one uses a third metric called the global warming potential with a time horizon of 20 years, then agriculture would contribute as much as 22% to global greenhouse gas emissions, and in fact would be the biggest contributor to global emissions today. So it's no wonder that given those very different answers, agriculture contributes 7, 14, 22% to global greenhouse gas emissions, that there's a large amount of confusion and debate around how important it actually is to reduce emissions from agriculture in order to support global climate change goals. So is there a better way, a simpler way, a less contentious way of providing an answer to that? And that's simply a question of going back to basics. It's a study that I've done with my colleague and good friend Harry Clark. What you see in front of you at the moment is the global average temperatures from about the year 1860 to 2017 with provisional data So the highest point is 2016. And we can use climate models and feed them historical greenhouse gas emissions, gas by gas, as well as natural emissions, as well as volcanic eruptions, as well as changes in solar output, and see how well they reproduce the observed trend in global temperatures. Well, the answer is, of course, in broad terms, climate models do a very good job in reproducing the observed warming trend. They do a scarily good job because it means that the climate models are correct when they say that a lot of the warming is due to the increase in greenhouse gas emissions from human activities. It's a very consistent picture here. Now, to answer our question, we can now use those climate models and we feed them all the historical greenhouse gas emissions, and then we feed them the historical greenhouse gas emissions just without the methane directly coming from livestock. If we do that, the model simulates a lesser amount of warming. Now we can rerun the model again and simply feed it historical emissions minus methane and minus nitrous oxide from livestock, and the model will simulate lesser amount of warming again. And that gives us a direct, straightforward, simple physics-based answer to the question, how much warming is actually due to livestock today? And the answer is surprisingly large amount. It's as much as 19% just based on the direct emissions of livestock of methane and nitrous oxide. Now, the reason why that's quite large is that these comparisons that are just based on greenhouse gas emissions usually neglect the cooling effect from aerosols that are emitted largely by the power sector, by the transport sector, by the industry sector, which masks some of the additional warming that's being caused by greenhouse gases. We can now take the same approach to look at the contribution of livestock to future warming. But of course we don't know how much the total future warming will be in the world, because that depends very much on whether countries follow their objectives under the Paris Agreement or let go of climate change concerns and increase the greenhouse gas emissions. So in front of you, you see two alternative scenarios. The upper scenario is one where greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase throughout the 21st century with basically no concern about climate change at all. Whereas the lower scenario is one where countries do undertake stringent efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from all sectors, such that net greenhouse gas emissions globally reach zero or even below zero by the end of the 21st century. In the upper scenario, if we now take out the contribution from livestock emissions to that warming, we can see that livestock continues to make a contribution to warming, but the relative contribution to the overall amount of warming that the world will experience is diminishing simply because the emissions from other sectors are expected to increase much more in that scenario than those from livestock. In other words, if the world is going to hell in a handbasket, it's not because of the livestock emissions. On the other hand, if you take out the livestock contribution to the warming under a stringent mitigation scenario, the contribution from livestock to the total amount of warming that the world would experience remains quite substantial. And that's to some extent simply because if all other sectors with a greater mitigation potential reduce their emissions towards zero, then eventually agriculture and livestock in particular starts to stick out even more as the main remaining source of emissions and therefore a remaining dominant contribution to warming. There is also an interesting further detail. If you look very closely, you see that the amount of warming from methane in the lower scenario, from methane from livestock, is actually greater than the amount of warming from methane in the upper scenario, even though we assumed that the total emissions are actually less in the lower scenario. The reason for that is that greenhouse gases influence each other in how effective they are in warming the atmosphere. And in a scenario where the world reduces emissions from all other sources, the warming effect of methane from livestock emissions becomes greater in a world that strongly reduces greenhouse gas emissions. So the key take-home message from this entire exercise is that if the world takes stringent measures to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement and reduces emissions from all other sectors, then livestock would make a substantive contribution to the amount of warming that the world would experience out to the year 2100. And that's despite an assumption that in that scenario, livestock emissions would not increase any further and would be about 30% less than they would be in a business as usual scenario, and fully taking into account the fact that methane is a short-lived greenhouse gas that does not accumulate in the atmosphere. So it's a simple physics-based conclusion that's not contingent on which particular greenhouse gas metric you use to compare CO2 with non-CO2 gases. So based on such information, what then might be an aspirational mitigation goal for agriculture? And I want to briefly take you back to some fundamental basics about how climate change and interaction between different gases operates. The graph in front of you shows the warming effect from emissions of different greenhouse gases, again in the unmitigated disaster scenario. Very clearly, carbon dioxide is the dominant greenhouse gas responsible for most of the warming that the world would experience. Now, if we try to avoid this warming and get the world back on a track towards the Paris Agreement only by reducing carbon dioxide emissions, we'd be faced with the prospect of having to squeeze carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere again from about the middle of the 21st century because of the increase in emissions of the other greenhouse gases. However, if we manage to reduce emissions of non-CO2 gases, we leave just a little bit more space for carbon dioxide, which means at least the carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere can stay there. And that is really important because carbon dioxide is a very long-lived greenhouse gas. It does not disappear by itself very, very quickly. So without effective non-CO2 mitigation, we would have to actively remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere via the expansive use of bioenergy combined with carbon capture and storage and widespread reforestation well before 2050 in order for the world to remain well below 2 degrees Celsius. And such a wide-scale application of bioenergy plus carbon capture and storage would be very expensive, is technologically unproven, and could have substantial negative side effects on food security and biodiversity. So non-CO2 mitigation is crucial to allow the effective CO2 mitigation to actually deliver the job that it has to do. So based on such considerations, a large team of authors got together last year to see whether we can come up with an aspirational goal for how much could agriculture reduce its emissions in order to support meeting the 2-degree target enshrined in the Paris Agreement. What we did is we looked at a range of global model studies that look at what emission reductions are possible from the energy sector and what emission reductions are therefore necessary from the agriculture sector in order to achieve the overall goal of limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius. We also looked at bottom-up studies that really go instance by instance through different mitigation options around the world and see how much contribution could they possibly make to achieving an overall emissions reduction from agriculture. What we came up with in the process is a proposal that agriculture should seek to reduce its emissions globally by 1 gigaton per year by the year 2030 relative to the business as usual baseline emissions that it's facing. The problem with that goal is that it's largely coming out of global model studies, that's the olive 3 bars on top of the figure, which take into account what the energy sector can do to reduce its emissions and what the agriculture can do theoretically to reduce its emissions. But I emphasize theoretically because practically, if you take into account that agriculture often is very strongly linked to food security, is tied to smallholder practices where you really can't apply a very high carbon price and expect farmers to drop their cows or fundamentally change their practices. If you look only at the technical practices up to a cost of $20 per ton, as in the lower 2 bars, the purple and the orange bar, then you get a much lesser mitigation potential. So we have a significant gap between what we think the agriculture sector has to contribute in order to keep the Paris Agreement goal feasible and what we currently can do based on currently known practices at moderate costs. They deliver only about 20 to 40% of the needed reduction, even if they're implemented at scale. So we have a fundamental challenge in our hand, but we also have a substantial groundswell, I believe, of changing the engagement with agriculture and greenhouse gas mitigation. The map in front of you, the countries in blue are countries that have said that they would like, in their contribution to the Paris Agreement, include mitigation of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions in their national goals and programs. It's a surprisingly large number of countries. 119 countries included agriculture mitigation in their commitments under the Paris Agreement. 64% of those are developing countries. Of course, those countries are not expecting to undertake very costly emissions reductions. They're looking for the synergies between improving productivity, improving efficiency of food production systems, and the climate benefits that that brings. What that means is there's a strong need to help those countries identify practical mitigation options that deliver on those synergies, help them improve their greenhouse gas estimation, their inventories, to ensure that their inventories capture productivity gains in the climate benefits that they bring, and to support them in implementation of any programs. Fortunately, there is now a plethora of international initiatives that are all concerned in some way or other with agricultural greenhouse gas emissions mitigation. There's a strong focus on soil carbon, which is seen as somewhat neglected and holds a large but very diffuse, very technically challenging potential either to increase soil carbon storage or at least to avoid further soil carbon losses. So we have organizations ranging from the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification to the Food and Agriculture Organization to more specific initiatives like the French 4 per mil initiative seeking to increase soil carbon storage around the world. A very large engagement in that. Very much at the science end, we need to better understand how we manage soil carbon before we can come up with specific recommendations to countries. There's a growing engagement in the space of climate change and food security, including on mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. It's not just about coping with the impacts of climate change. There's a very active engagement to seek synergies between greenhouse gas mitigation and food security. Of course, a key part of that is also the Global Research Alliance on Agriculture Greenhouse Gases, which was launched, championed very strongly by New Zealand, and where New Zealand continues to provide a very strong scientific leadership. Last but not least, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is in the process of preparing a range of reports that will all touch upon climate change and greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, not least a special report on climate change and land, which is in fact the reason why I can't be here in person today, because we're in the process of seeking agreement on the outline of the report, which will be completed by the end of 2019. So let me conclude. I hope I've shown that livestock make a substantial contribution to climate change and that this is not an artifact of greenhouse gas accounting. The contribution of livestock to climate change is real and will remain real into the future. Therefore, mitigation of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions is necessary to support achieving the Paris Agreement goals, of course, as are the efforts from all other sectors. If agriculture were the only one to seek to reduce its emissions, we wouldn't gain anything. But if other sectors are taking strong mitigation action, then it is vital that agriculture joins those efforts. And fortunately, interest in agriculture mitigation is growing internationally, which is very positive, I believe, but of course is still only emerging, and people are still seeking the synergies between their development goals, rural development, sustainable development, economic development, food security, and agricultural mitigation, which means there's an increasing need for science-based solutions and guidance for the implementation of such solutions. So that's all I wanted to cover today. Thanks very much for your attention. I would like to acknowledge the funding that I receive in my overall work from the New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Research Centre and from the New Zealand government's support in the scientific leadership for the Global Research Alliance. But of course, my research findings and conclusions don't necessarily represent the views of the New Zealand government, the GRA, or its member countries.